Do you have a favorite?
Not meant to. But mostly the unloved ones, the unvisited ones, the cases that get dusty and ignored. All the broken and shunned creatures. Someone's got to care for them. Who shall it be if not us?
Yes.
Welcome to Rune Soup, a weekly podcast about magic, culture, and the very best new and old ideas for living in this world. Coming to you from 43 degrees south on a small farm in deepest Tasmania. My name is Gordon, and I shall be your host. This week, in what accidentally turned out to be my birthday special and something of a gift to myself, I suppose, we welcome to the show the one and only Dr. Joseph P. Farrell. Many of you will have no doubt, I'm sure, encountered Dr. Farrell's work in any number of different domains: alternate history, ufology, modern history, politics, you name it. And he joins us today to talk about some of the thoughts and perspectives that underpin a lot of that wide-ranging work and interest. So music, language, magic as harmonics, and what our relationship to culture is and our role within it. Very good stuff. Enjoy. Dr. Farrell, a long time coming. Thank you very, very much for your time.
Thanks for having me back, Gordon.
Yeah, absolutely. So, actually, question the one, how's Shiloh?
Shiloh is wonderful. She's coming along. We've been together for about 2 years. For those who don't know, she's my little adopted pooch that I got from an animal rescue shelter. She'd been through 4 shelters and across 2 state lines, and no one wanted her. So she had issues, but she's coming along fine and now howling happily at sirens. So
Oh, well, so a lot of howling at the moment, I guess.
Yep.
Yeah. We were actually, funnily enough, originally going to chat around the release of Microcosm and Medium. And as I was I ended up keeping the questions and I was sort of looking at them. And it might be a case of cometh the hour, cometh the podcast guest, right? Because
Yeah.
I can't think of a more urgent time to have a discussion around, I guess, like the loss and recovery of coherence, which is in fact what the latest book is also about in a way, right?
Mm-hmm. Yes, it is.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, see how is it your read? Because it's my read that at the moment we're sort of witnessing a kind of pulling forward of a bunch of technocratic plans for reasons like the timeline has been stepped up for reasons that we aren't necessarily sure of at the moment, but they probably aren't good, right? Would that be a reasonable?
Yeah. That's my exact read. This whole coronavirus, Fauci, Lieber, Wuhan, Bill Gates virus narrative, as I like to call it, I think was an operation that they had planned for some time. They updated it, dusted it off, and rolled it out, in my opinion, to accomplish several objectives. And then, of course, once that began to peter out, as it clearly was in the last couple of weeks, we had the George Floyd matter in the United States, clearly a case of, in my opinion, regardless of all the narratives that are beginning to emerge, the background research on Mr. Floyd, on the cop that took him down, regardless of those narratives, you had a clear case, in my opinion, of police overreach, of killing a man without any sort of due process or concern. And of course, again, there are people questioning even that narrative now. But they rolled that out just in time. And what I can't understand is the protests going on worldwide, as, you know, kind of in response to this. So to me, Gordon, yeah, the whole thing looks like this has been some sort of op. We're seeing all sorts of media campaigns to gin up the fear, to gin up division when there really isn't any. So I look at the whole thing with a very jaundiced eye. Let's just put it that way.
Yeah, and one of the things, and it's obviously very true that people point out when we have to have a challenging discussion like this, is the many of the underlying reasons are entirely valid. Like I used to live in Bristol. It's when I first moved there, the I'm not sure if it still does, but the megabus pulls up out the front of Colston Music Hall, and basically the first thing I heard about Bristol was as someone got off the bus, it's like, that's a slave owner. He used to own slaves, and we named things after him, right? And you think so. There is definitely a case for having these discussions, right? But because it's funny, it's cosmic, and it's always cosmic. So if they're pulling forward a technocratic plan, it seems to me, to use your words, it seems to me we need to pull forward the project of owning the culture, right?
Yes.
And funnily enough, because it's become so biopolitical with things like, bodily sovereignty and so on, it's almost like we want to use the anthropologist word, we need to own the nature culture, because now it's to do with like organic food supplies and so on. And it just, whatever happens, it seems like you want to run down the list of, well, how do I respond? And it's somehow cosmic that it's like always the same response, isn't it?
Well, yeah, this is what bothers me about this whole Fauci-Lieber virus narrative, because we have Bill Gates, as I like to call him now, pushing his vaccines and so on. And I'm with Catherine Fitz here. What he's pushing aren't vaccines. They, by his own admission, they would modify people's RNA. So I'm wondering, where does my body, my choice begin and leave off? This is the same crowd that's been pushing abortion on demand for decades. So now all of a sudden it's no longer our body, our choice. You're going to get vaccinated, like it or not. So by owning the culture, I think we have to recognize that we've at some point just to have to stand up and say no, because they're pushing an agenda here. And what bothers me, Gordon, is especially since you mentioned microcosm and medium, Gates has this idea that he wants to track everybody. They're now hiring professional trackers and tracers in this country, in various cities and states, to track people who've either contracted the virus or, in some cases, people who haven't. And Gates wants to modify his viruses with tracking mechanisms. So, again, we're going back to how much crud are they putting into these things without our knowledge. Yeah. And let's go back even a few years ago, Gordon. There were stories, I think about 3 or 4 years ago, if you've been watching the GMO foods debate. Well, there were articles that came out, I even blogged about a few of them on my website, that they were talking about actually putting vaccines into GMOs. So what are they not willing to do in order to maintain their control over people? So it's all kind of coming together, and like you say, it's a big kind of technocratic push right at the moment.
So the latest book, Tower of Babel Moment, right? I have this. I'm very inspired by the Jungian idea that you kind of know an archetype when you encounter it because it's kind of infinitely deep, right?
Yes.
And the fall of the Tower of Babel, that whole story is inarguably something like that. Because coming back to essentially a worldwide control grid, it seems to me that is a Tower of Babel.
Yes, yeah, it is. It is. You look at the Tower of Babel story as it's presented in the book of Genesis, and it's a very unusual story when you look at it in the context of other biblical narratives about divine intervention. Because in the Tower story, the reason for the intervention is not because of human sin, but rather because, as the text itself states, if they complete this, they will not be restrained from doing whatever it is they imagine to do. So in other words, it's some sort of threat. And we're looking at, I think, a kind of similar narrative now. But in this case, again, you get the idea that there are a bunch of technocrats, and that's clearly implied by some of the stories, that emerge in the apocryphal and pseudepigraphal literature about the Tower. We're looking at kind of a technocratic project right now to cement all of humanity into some sort of great collective that they can manage and control. And I think it's very timely that this whole virus narrative comes out, and this is exactly what they're talking about. They're talking about tracking and tracing and quote unquote vaccinating everybody. So again, we're living in very biblical times.
I was just going to say, but like very specifically Old Testament, like it's amazing. Like we're all gardening, all the hits are there, right?
Yeah, they are.
It is. I have a distinct memory in kindergarten of first hearing the Tower of Babel story in religious education, right? And it's funny because, and we'll talk about it, you follow the archetype through that angle of sort of human overreach and so on. But I remember my teacher saying, what if all having the one language was really bad for us? And the metaphor, the example, I actually used a metaphor, was sort of like as a mother shooing a child's hand away from a hot stove, like, don't touch that. And it's interesting. It's always struck me as that human vanity toward that kind of total control, that totalitarian surveillance, probably ends badly. And so you can make a case for God going like, no, don't touch that. I'm going to knock that down, right?
Right.
Which kind of gives me hope.
Well, it does me too, because we're, in a certain sense already, Gordon, we're looking at the backlash against this whole plan, especially with the coronavirus narrative, because there are, I'm one of those who does not wear a mask for my own health reasons. We're being fed a narrative that masks are good, masks will protect you, masks will protect others, and yet there's a total suppression of the data regarding the opposite conclusion with these masks. So in other words, people are already kind of rebelling against this idea of totalitarian control simply through the use of a ginned up health panic. So yeah, and again, I think it's going to end badly. I think this push now for tracking and tracing everybody is going to end badly. People just are not going to be corralled. What we're dealing with ultimately, Gordon, in my opinion, is this technocratic transhumanist dream. And if you look at what the transhumanists are really wanting to do, merge man and machine and all of this stuff, what they're really talking about is an anti-human or an inhuman agenda. And ultimately, this is why I think it's going to fail, because people eventually wake up and realize that that's what they want to put into place, and they don't want to live life that way. That's pure and simple.
Yeah, it's an assault on authentic life,
exactly.
And it's I think I struggle. No, I don't struggle with it, but I don't understand how people can frame this for themselves without almost like a metaphysics of possession. Because if you're talking about, and it's true, and this is one of my other favorite books of yours is, I think it might actually be my favorite, is Thrice Great Hermetica, right? And in a lot of your books, you do actually trace this anti-life impulse across the centuries, and it's interesting. It's this is another archetype, right? It's a fall.
Yes, it is. It really is. Yeah, exactly.
Which kind of gives you an indication of, well, a fairly firm hint, if you will, of how we should be thinking about those kind of ideas. It's
well, I agree. And again, the thing that has emerged, if you look at this whole coronavirus narrative, what they're asking us to do is inhuman. I mean, my word, everybody in masks. Don't shake hands, rub elbows, keep 6 feet away from each other. How do you interact with your family or loved ones if you are driven by that kind of fear tactic? Well, you don't. And ultimately, this is why I think it will fail, because they're asking people to do something ultimately that is inhuman.
Yeah. It's from the beginning, and it's the typical kind of, particularly American media response to whatever Trump tweets, right? When he said, like, what sunlight and warmth are good for your health, and all these articles came out going, the sun won't help you, and I'm like, you're literally going to war with the sun, the source of all life.
Yeah, I know. I know. It's so Looney Tunes, Gordon, that it's breathtaking at times. I mean, my word, we just had the story come out recently from the president of El Salvador, and I even blogged about this, who admitted that he and other world leaders had been recommended to take hydroxychloroquine. Well, Trump came out with that, and they were all over him for that. And now it turns out, well, it does actually have prophylactic preventative qualities when it comes to this virus. So my question is, okay, if we've got a medicine out there that has a prophylactic function, why on earth are we talking about vaccines? Because a prophylactic is, in effect, a vaccine of a certain type against a particular disease. Well, again, it's because that's not what they want. They want to track and control everybody. And the vaccine is the way that they plan to do it, in my opinion. So again, it's another one of these fall of man things playing itself out again on the world stage. And again, it will fail because ultimately the agenda is inhuman. That's just the bottom line.
Yeah. One of the, I guess, metaphors I return to for now is, I call it like the Rivendell project. Everyone needs to be, speaking of Oxford, everyone needs to be the last lovely house east of the sea. So Rivendell was a place as Middle-earth fell into chaos, where essentially they owned the culture, right?
Yes.
And hence the metaphor of it kind of working for now. And where I want to take the discussion next is kind of that if we're having, this is a choice on an individual basis between coherence and decoherence, ultimately, right? That's underlying everything, owning the culture, asserting sovereignty over your health, all the rest of it. So I want to talk about music. I want to actually hit some of the microcosm and medium questions, because funnily enough, when we talk about music and coherence, and then we can talk about linguistics and coherence, I think we can see some of the through lines between the books.
Oh, yes.
So as a long-time out and proud Giza Death Star member, I like when people ask you questions like this. Dr. Farrell, what is music?
Well, music, and the point I was trying to make in microcosm and medium is that there was a sea change in the philosophy or cosmology of music from the 18th century to the 19th. In other words, from the Baroque classical styles to what would eventually become the Romantic style. And part of it is very interesting in that the Baroque era had the idea that music was a means of conjuring, or, if you will, even manipulating the universal, natural, inherent to human nature passions through certain harmonic and contrapuntal procedures. So in other words, a Baroque or even a classical composer like a Haydn or somebody like that was operating with the idea that there was a universal tonal language that human nature itself responded to. When you get to the Romantic era, something changes in that they abandon that cosmology in favor of a cosmology of self-expression. In other words, a composer, let's say after Beethoven, has the idea that his music is conveying his or her own personal emotional responses and communications and so on. So you get a very different cosmology behind this. And the reason I say it's linked to language is during the 19th century, one of my favorite Romantic composers for the organ, a fellow by the name of Charles-Marie Widor, had a student whose name was Albert Schweitzer. And of course, we all know who Albert Schweitzer was. And Schweitzer pointed out to Widor that Widor was not understanding the way Baroque music worked, that the actual figures in the music itself were based ultimately on textual references. So what Schweitzer did, he wrote a 2-volume study of J.S. Bach, which I would recommend anybody read if you really want to understand the cosmology that's operating in the Baroque era and behind the music. Because he points out that in the organ chorales that Bach set, the figures in the music correspond to the words of the text of the hymn or the chorale or whatever it is that he's setting. And you find these figures over and over and over again, and then you go on to find them in pure instrumental music, be it for organ or harpsichord or orchestra or whatever. You find these figures over and over again. So in other words, there's a kind of code that's going on, that the music itself is always presenting this cosmology of the natural affections common to all of humanity. And it's doing so with certain formula or procedures. And it's a fascinating study, but you lose that in the Romantic era. You lose that quality of the music, and it begins to become much more subjective until, by the end of the 19th century, you have music that's really kind of cacophonous and difficult to listen to. And again, I think it's because in a certain sense it's unnatural. So there's a lot going on there, but you're right, there is a link. There is a definite musical sort of grammar. I encourage people all the time to listen to the lectures of Leonard Bernstein that he gave at Harvard University in 1973, because he goes into this a great deal and tries to show people what some of these things are that they might be missing with a cursory listening of some music. But it's definitely there, and it's interesting that you raise this in the context of Tower of Babel, because if you look at it a certain way, you can look at the history of music, particularly in the 19th century, as kind of a musical Tower of Babel. That by the end of the 19th century, you get Stravinsky and the Rite of Spring and the riot it caused, literally, when it was first performed. You get people like Arnold Schoenberg and so on. You get a kind of Tower of Babel happening musically, where music becomes not understandable anymore.
It's so from memory, Microcosm and Medium talks about whether Plato's dialogues might be treatises on music, right? In the sense that, and this is definitely in it, but you talk about the relationship between the microcosm and macrocosm is harmonic, and it's sort of how, I'm using speech marks here, but it's sort of how this universal tonal system, quote unquote, works, right? And it's how you could maybe, and this is why I like Thrice Great Hermetica, you could use that premise to kind of look back through history for a fall,
Yes,
it's like the universe is broken by something, and I think that's really fascinating.
Yeah, there is a case to be made. I talk about it all the way back in Giza Death Star, and I repeat it in Grid of the Gods, in Thrice Great Hermetica, and then again in Microcosm and Medium. There is a case to be made that the Pythagorean secret was that they had discovered a way of tempering the natural harmonic series in a way that's very similar to modern Western music. Most people don't know this, but the harmonic series that generates the notes on a scale on a keyboard, the scale that you see on a keyboard is not the natural harmonic series, because in the natural harmonic series it would be impossible, due to the placement of the fifth overtone in the harmonic series, it would be impossible to modulate from one key to another in the course of a piece because of that fifth overtone. So what happened was they adjusted it mathematically. They performed a small mathematical adjustment that would allow all 12 notes on the keyboard to function as a tonal center in any of the keys, which allows you to modulate without having to stop and retune the instrument. But there's a case to be made, that being said, that this was known all the way back by the Pythagoreans and then subsequently by Plato, that they knew how to produce the kind of music that we hear today in modern Western music. And to give you an example of what I mean, sit down and try to listen to Hindu music, which does not have that tuning adjustment. And it becomes very difficult for the Western ear to listen to because it doesn't modulate. It stays in one key. So this is something I think that was very well known to the ancients, but they protected it. And again, the reason that they did, Gordon, is something that people have to understand and appreciate, because the ancient doctrine of microcosm and macrocosm and so on was intimately tied to the idea of the music of the spheres. So in other words, it was a cosmological secret they were protecting. If you can tinker with or fine tune, so to speak, the natural mathematical harmonic series, what you were doing is, in effect, you were manipulating or tinkering with the fundamental basis of cosmology itself. And this is why the music was such a big secret. This idea of a well-tempered system of musical tuning was such a cosmological secret for so long. I hope that makes some sort of sense to people, because it's actually a very important thing.
Well, it does. And there's two questions, because I've always wanted to ask you the first one, but what you just said there about it being a cosmological secret that can, the subtext being it can be weaponized, gets to things like the Tower of Babel and Giza and so on. But before we get there,
right.
I'm with you. The analysis, I guess I need some additional help on how the analysis works on a global basis, because it certainly works for Western music, right? So but if I think about the time I spent in ceremony with Australian Aborigines or in Polynesia or something, it's not a tonal system like Baroque music, but it's definitely resonant to the point of transcendence. So is it,
yes.
Do we need, how to say this, do we need to slide like another metaphysics of music underneath this so that the tonal system is almost like the blueprints for a weapon? Like, it's other things, but it's that. But it works because of a kind of underlying metaphysics of music that is more, I guess, global, because it doesn't, I can't take the loss of tonal competence that we see over the 18th and 19th century and apply that anywhere but the West, where it does apply quite well.
Right. There are people out there that are arguing for what you're talking about, for a more global or inclusive or system of harmony. The problem is that every one that has been tried or advanced simply does not seem to appeal to the ear. And I suspect that, in my case, I would argue that is because you have a fundamentally Sumerian tinkering in the Western tonal harmony. Believe it or not, it's Sumerian based, and that's where it really gets very interesting, because that in its turn invokes a system of weights and measures that is very, very odd and unusual, and yet we find them almost universally applied in the ancient world. So I would argue the reverse. I would argue that because you see a system of weights and measures that is in its turn kind of universal and more or less Sumerian in the way it approaches things, that the well-tempered system of Western music probably is that universal, and that other systems fail in that, again, once you set a fundamental in other tuning systems, you're kind of stuck in that key, in that song, so to speak, rather than being able to create music that is multi-keyed and multi-tonal.
Okay, so this has really been helpful. So it's almost like we have global music, which is the music of the world, but we have universal music, which is, and because it is a one-off, it is in fact suspicious. It's suspicious that, like, where do we get that from? That's the let's look at what Bernstein actually says. If you've listened to those lectures, they're fascinating, and he points out that the pentatonic scale is really the first. That's the scale you would get if you played all the black keys on a keyboard. All right. The pentatonic scale is very interesting because different cultures construe the center of the scale, the tonal center of the scale, in different ways. You've got Polynesian pentatonics, you've got Chinese, you've got Japanese, you've got African, and so on and so forth. Well, it's the same scale, but they all construe the tonal center of the scale differently. And that I think is a true universal.
in the linguistic sense that linguists talk about substantive universals. And he also points out that the sing-song chant that children sing, na 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 na, well, that sing-song chant is actually based on the emergence of the first differing overtones in the harmonic series, believe it or not. And that little sing-song chant is presented in the order that the harmonic series actually emerges. So yeah, I do think that there is a universal, but it's that slight mathematical adjustment that I think is also a universal. It's, in other words, it's a philosophy that's basically saying nature presents us a puzzle to solve. And the puzzle requires a slight little mathematical adjustment in order to be able to function tonally with any of the 12 notes on the keyboard as the tonal center, or in other words, as the key of a piece. So you're dealing with a philosophy of music and a cosmology by dint of that fact that's very unique in the world, and it's precisely because it is a one-off that I think it comes under such attack.
So the sing-song voice, I didn't make this connection before, but in Sefer Ratziel, which is like, I think it's the earliest complete kind of like Jewish angel grimoire. If you want to talk to the angels, you go to a graveyard and you speak in a sing-song voice like a child.
Right.
Yeah. All right. That's cool, because if we're talking about now that's situated it for me, because otherwise, not that I would say this is the discussion, but if I didn't have it, I would always be like, well, how do I solve it for the world without it being almost like a cultural superiority claim? But it's not. It's like it's evidence of extra dimensional contact in a way. That tracks for me, I think.
Well, the odd problem that we're faced with here is that we think of our modern Western music as specifically Western, but again, if you look at the roots of it, it really isn't Western at all. It's Sumerian.
Well, so's the circle and the year and the week. Exactly. Like we still live in. We're talking about biblical times. We still live in Sumerian times, and that is that's a question, or that's a reality to ponder for a lot of people, I think. How is that the case, right?
Yeah, exactly. Well, again, I think it's because if you look at the system of weights and measures, in Genes, Giants, Monsters, and Men, one of my books, I go into megalithic systems of measures, and it's very odd that they are so universal and that they do appear somehow to be Sumerian based. If you go to Sumeria and look at their system of weights and measures, oddly enough, they are astronomical and geodetic in nature. So in other words, we can forget this idea, this Looney Tunes idea that modern quackademics has pushed out there, that ancient weights and measures were based on human body parts. Yeah,
it's not. Yeah,
that's just total nonsense. You can't have a system of weights and measures based on that, because it'll change from person to person and region to region. You can't have commerce that way. So you need a system of weights and measures simply for having any sort of global commerce. And that system of weights and measures needs to be geodetically and or astronomically based. So again, if we're dealing with a system of weights and measures that's coming out of a cosmological view, and then you take that same system of arithmetic, so to speak, and apply it to the harmonic series, again, you're dealing with something cosmological in nature. This is the way these people thought.
And it's funny, it is a system that is based on human body ratios. It's just not the way they mean it, right? Like it's
just not the way they mean it. No,
it's microcosm medium again. So I can't remember if I told you this, but because I'm born and raised Australian, but when I moved back to the UK, because of UK ancestry, I struggled in the first 4 months, maybe, converting from kilometers to miles with my GPS in the car and what have you. And then it clicked. And then it not just clicked, but I can't click back, because so a quarter mile, I know how far that is in my head, as opposed to 311 meters, right?
I'm so glad you say this. Go on.
And this is what I mean by it is, in fact, the human, it is a human scale. Like, it is in fact a human measurement, just not the way they mean, because it was done in coherence with the view of different planets on the horizon, and the whole thing kind of nests together and is far more organic. And it's weird. Like, I can do, I'm fine with like boiling water at 100 degrees or what have you, but I still now think in that, I don't want to say, it is analog, but I don't want to say analog terms. It's actually just the ratios of the universe. Does that make sense?
It makes a lot of sense to me, because I have the same experience. I know how far a mile is. You know, the imperial system looks at first glance like it is a complete hodgepodge of irrationality and incoherence. But yet, when you start plumbing the metrology behind it and realize how similar it is in many respects to these ancient systems of measure that you find in the megaliths and so on, then you realize why it is that it's much easier for us to think in terms of a mile and have it more or less in our heads how far that is, rather than a kilometer. You know, the metric system, again, appears rational and coherent. But when you look at what it's based on and compare it to the cosmology and metrology of the imperial system, you come away scratching your head, because the imperial system makes much more sense in terms of all the data of geodetic measures and astronomical measures and so on. It fits better the entire system. And that's why I think it has had, you know, such longevity.
Literally Neolithic. The pint is Neolithic.
Yeah, it is.
You know.
Yeah, it is a Neolithic measure, and for a reason. And again, we have to get it into our heads that a rational system may appear rational, but the rationality of it is an artificiality. Whereas the rationality of something like the pentatonic scale or the Western equal tempered system, these things may appear to be irrational and arbitrary at first glance, but they're really not.
So, do you think you'll get your Gates vaccine in milliliters or ounces?
I'm not getting it, period.
It's the same hijack, right? It's funny, because I want to talk to you about Gnosticism in a minute, because it's the assault on human life that we're seeing now is my example of what a demiurge looks like, because it's an angry toddler at her birthday party telling people to have fun. You stand over there, you go on the horsey. It's this kind of synthetic version of what a party is supposed to be like when it's run by a tyrant. And the whole thing of replacing the organic measurements of the universe with its own one. You will use this. You will use this. Right. Is there and it's funny because like I every time I hear your definition of, I've got to give you this because I love Gnosticism. I'm not a Gnostic, but I love Gnosticism, right? I'm fascinated by it. And when you describe it as and this is fair, it's a valid description of, it's almost like a mind virus that will attack and erode intellectual structures. I think that's fair. But by the same token, if I think about this, I think of some of the Gnostic scholars who take the minority position that has some merit to it, in my case, that Gnosticism slightly predates Christianity because it comes out of Judaism, and the evidence they have for that is a profound disappointment with a Jewish elite complicity with the Roman Empire and the fall of the temple. And so it feels like it's a disappointed diaspora Judaic project. And the other piece of evidence they have for this position is that the Gnostics are obsessed with Genesis and kind of like looking in Genesis for what the hell has gone wrong, right? And the point is, and it's a good point, but I don't think it's quite true in the case of Alexandria. No one else would care enough, except Jews, to be in Genesis that deeply, going, what happened? How did this all go on? And so, whenever you talk about Gnosticism as a ideology that can attack and assault, that's definitely in there. That's a kind of Luciferian thing that you can find. But by the same token, I think an author who has plumbed Sumerian and Old Testament texts and so on, looking for how it may or may not map to a cosmic war that might be that might have some implications for our present state. It just seems a little bit Gnostic to me. What do you reckon?
Well, it is Gnostic in that sense. Yeah, it is, because it's a hallmark of those types of religions that the text is all important. So, my problem is that if you look at the way that both the early Gnostics after the appearance of Christianity and then the church itself responded to all of this, it was a case of it's got to be either this or that. And for my point of view, I think it's a much more subtle problem than responding in that way. For example, if you look at the Gospel of St. John, and I mentioned this at the tail end of the Tower of Babel, if you look at the appearance of the Tetragrammaton in the book of Exodus, I am who I am. Well, it's been pointed out by some people that Ea Asher Ea, which is I am who I am in Hebrew, that might be a pun, because Ea is also an Akkadian version of the name Enki. Okay. So in other words, there might be a pun going on in that biblical text. Well, the reason that might be important is that Christ himself in the Gospel of St. John says words to the effect, amen, amen, before Abraham was, I am. Okay. And he then goes on in another portion in the same gospel to say, you are of your father the devil, and he was a liar and murderer from the beginning. Well, what's that? The Gnostics jumped all over that text. In the Greek version of, amen, amen, before Abraham was, I am, that in the Greek is an emphatic usage. In other words, in the Greek, to say I am, it's only necessary to say the word imi, I am. But in the Greek text in the gospel, it's ego imi, I am. So in other words, not that guy, Yahweh, that guy was a faker. I'm the real thing, is basically the thing that you take away from that emphatic usage. So in other words, that means you have to look very carefully at the character in the Old Testament who's doing all of those things. And does that character align with Christ or does it not? And in some cases it does not. So in other words, I'm thinking that maybe that old either this or that, either the church's way or the Gnostic way, that attempt to frame it in a binary sort of choice may not be exactly what's required. It may be a much more subtle reading of those texts than either side wants to admit. I hope like that's making.
Oh, it makes complete
I hope
sense.
That's making some sort of sense.
No, I love it. I love it. I guess because. This is the thing. It's not like I say it at parties, but I say it to gauge people's reaction, which is I think the Old Testament God is a more sophisticated definition or description of God than the New Testament one. What do you say to that? And it's usually just to start a conversation about it, but it's because. It seems to me like on a mystic level, if everything comes from God, that includes the misfortune as well as the good fortune. So you actually have as you say, like a subtler understanding of, and even if it is an evil one behind the evil, that ultimately comes from God. So in the first appearance of Satan is in Job, and he's not in hell, he's on earth, right? So you kind of have, as you say, the invitation to subtlety in your kind of like quest for God. And I think that's cool. That solved it for me, because I'm like, yes, I get, like, it's usually in the chats when someone brings up Gnosticism, or when you look at what a modern Gnostic project might look like, and we're kind of in one right now, right? Of the sort of wrecking of structures, and without distinction, right? Just like a wreck. I'm like, yeah, that's definitely in there. This is cool. That's really helped it.
Well, let's remember that Gnosticism in its classical manifestations was really a technique of the manipulation of language. And as such, again, it plugs directly into the Tower of Babel story, particularly in its pseudepigraphal recensions, the glosses on the story that you find in all the pseudepigraphal works. Because, again, you have this idea that we're going to destroy this project by tinkering with the language so that people don't understand each other. And it's a classic way of breaking down any society to begin to manipulate language as a kind of code that the initiates understand one thing by a word, and the hoi polloi understand something entirely different. This was a classic case with what the Bolsheviks did in Russia, when they took power in Russia and started manipulation of the Russian language itself, and even to the point of getting rid of some old Russian alphabetical characters. It went that far. So you break down a society by assaults on language, and through the assault on language, an assault on institutions. So it's an old Gnostic thing that we're looking at going on right now.
Yeah. You mentioned the linguistics. This is probably a good pivot to discussing that in the Tower of Babel moment. And it kind of brings it back to Oxford in a way. So 2 questions, double-barreled. What's monogenesis? Why no Owen Barfield in this book?
Oh, boy. Listen, if I had tried to get into the Inklings and all of that on language, the book would have grown like Topsy. Sure. And it probably never would have been a book that I could end. But it's very simply a matter of me having to choose, what I want to talk about and ignore some others. And it doesn't mean I'm not going to talk about it later on. I may do that. But it was simply trying to pare down what was already a complex book to its bare essentials. But anyway, monogenesis is the name that linguists have for the idea that all human languages descend from some unknown, no longer extant parent. And it's very interesting, if you look at the work of linguists over the last 2 centuries, they really have done a phenomenal job of classifying language families. And particularly since some linguists broke ranks and decided that they would apply the same classification techniques that was used to carve out what are called the Indo-European language families, and apply the same techniques to American Indian languages, to African languages, and so on and so forth. And lo and behold, what happens when you do that is you end up with about 12 major human language families that all share certain general characteristics in common. So the idea of monogenesis is being hammered home by the linguists themselves in a very, very interesting way. And interestingly enough, it also parallels, as I try to point out in the book, it also parallels the major human genotypes, the haplogroups within the human genome, that distinguish races and so on and so forth. And it's amazingly parallel in that respect. So I do think that in their own way, they're kind of dealing with the Tower of Babel moment, although you will never find a linguist mentioning that myth in their monogenesis studies.
No, it's what I love about your books is that they are they're about a thing. So here's this linguistic idea of monogenesis, but they're about a thing as you understand it. So the idea that this is why I asked the Barfield question, right? Which is even if, because it's what I like about Barfield is that he sort of said that trying to find the origin of language is like trying to find the origin of origins, because you can't get behind it. You can't get behind the language. And that kind of coming back to the, topology and metaphors and all the rest of it, and the harmonics we were just talking about, that sort of means that with things like language and harmonics and so on, we're in this clunky situation of talking about it's all the one stuff. So even though the linguists might think they're even experimentally looking for monogenesis, it's cosmic in its implications. So even if there isn't a moment in human history where we were all speaking the one language and then we got scattered, it's somehow a description of a thing in the universe instead. And that's what I like about Barfield. So he's like, the UG theory, for people who don't know, the sort of like UG theory of language is that I was sleeping in a cave next to someone. I wake up in the morning and I hit my head on the cave, and the guy before I hit my head, said ugh. And so the next morning he says ugh, and I don't hit my head. And language begins with these sort of crass descriptions of objects around primitive human societies. And Barfield said, no, it's the opposite. And actually, if you look at how indigenous cultures that, and I don't want to say they're the same as Stone Age people, obviously, but have lifeways that are recognizable, they're all over the place with language and complexity and metaphor and meaning and so on. So the idea that Barfield thought we actually declined in complexity from a previous state. Now that is why I asked, why is it in the book? Because, you know what I mean? Like, Monogenesis is a quest for something hyperdimensionally significant, I think.
Well, it's interesting that you mentioned that hypothesis, because I agree with it by and large. And I spent a great deal of time in that book talking about Leibniz and his quest for what he called a characteristica universalis. In other words, a way of formal analysis that he suspected that the ancients had, and that they had either disguised or lost. And interestingly enough, one of the things that popped out as I was exploring him and this idea of a really ancient complexity were that the symbology, the petroglyphs all over the world that are accompanied by these bizarre symbols are almost universal. And we're still using some of these signs and symbols to this day. And they're tens of thousands of years old. You know, the cross hatches, arrows, symbolisms of the heart, and so on and so forth. All of these things are very, very old symbols that we still use today. And I began to wonder if, in fact, we were looking at a sort of symbolic written language that was able to function in a variety of differing spoken language cultures. It's another twist to Barfield's idea of ancient complexity. It's another twist to the idea of linguistic monogenesis and so on. I do think it's there, and I think it's there for a very important reason that goes back to music. Every indication is that these ancient cultures, all of them without exception, knew of the phenomenon of the harmonic series. And there's every indication even that they understood that it was more or less a universal phenomenon. It was a cosmological phenomenon. If that's the case, and we have the idea that the ancients are much more in tune with the cosmology itself, then by the nature of the case, their language is going to be that way. And their language, as a result of that, is going to be correspondingly complex, regardless of which language you look at. Yeah. And again, that's something that you see. You can go and study the African languages or study the American Indian languages, and there are these horribly complex structures that they have for getting across some extraordinarily subtle ideas. So again, you know, we're not looking at a case of we evolved from simplicity to complexity. It's almost the exact opposite.
It is, and also for it to be a true monogenesis, I guess, again using quotation marks, right? The thing again, it's like, it's a metaphysical question. A language isn't just those couple of years you spent learning French in high school, and like because talking about metaphor and analogy, a metaphor is literally a spell, right? Like it is a spell. So it's not. It is. We're talking about a kind of cosmic semiotics. If you're looking for the origin of language, you're looking for when words and symbols matched and moved coherently, right? That's so it's, I know you talk about this all the time, and I like it. It's your version of when I say I like the Old Testament God better, which is if we worked out what grimoires describe a broken system of this essentially, and if we ever found it again, we could just get rid of them all. And this is kind of the role of metaphor and language is. If people don't sit with it, it's eerie, right? Like you have to understand that the semiotics of the word jaguar and a jaguar and what would that be like in a state of full coherence? And that for me, I think, is the quest of what's behind like looking for monogenesis. I don't know if when the last time you read any Claude Lévi-Strauss was, but he's a famous, obviously 20th century French anthropologist. And his definition of, like, in Amerindian times, like the definition of myth, he said, was stories from a time when humans and animals did not differentiate themselves. And in fact, if you look at the fall in Amazonia, it's actually the animals who fall. It's not the humans, but the animals kind of forget that they're made of the same one personness. So the development of the universe is this, kind of like this process of diversification. But this is kind of what I mean by, I think the idea that we all had at one point one language, I think it's folly to look for it on Earth because it's kind of hyperdimensionally significant. I think in Amazonia, that's their understanding of the same thing. We used to be in a state of coherence that we are not.
Yes. I think what you're suggesting there is basically what I'm getting at with my topological metaphor of the medium that I mentioned so much in my books, because that is it's a grammar in a certain sense, it's a mathematics in a certain sense, but it's not about numbers, it's not about calculation, it's about the precise processes behind thought itself. So in other words, you can end up with a cosmology that is highly analogical in nature, and that's exactly what I think the ancient cosmology was. It was a cosmology based off of analogy. And at some point, what you're suggesting is that the analogies become scrambled. They become inept rather than apt analogies. And again, that may sound like I'm just blowing wind, but I'm not. What I'm suggesting is that everybody has this sense of when an analogy is apt or when it doesn't make any sense. We've all said some things like, well, that analogy doesn't hold for the following reasons. Well, what gives us that information? What gives us that insight? And I would suggest that it's part of the innate rationality of human nature that suggests that. And if that's the case, then it's also a cosmological phenomenon. Again, going back to microcosm, macrocosm doctrine that the ancients held. So I think there's something to that. And another thing that your talk about animals also suggests is, again, in our Western culture, I would put this as part of the product of medieval scholasticism. We have the idea that human beings are rational and animals are not. Well, again, I think rather than looking at things in this binary dialectical way, you have to look at it as more or less of a continuum. Anybody who's ever owned a pet knows that there is a kind of rationality in animals that is very surprising at times. I like to tell the story of my friend Scott DeHart, who has an African gray parrot. And I used to, when I was living out in California, I helped out my friend Scott by taking his youngest son to school every morning. And as he and I would leave the apartment, Murray's cage was right by the door, and I'd tell Murray, "You be a good bird, I'll be right back," okay? And one day, as Benny and I were going out the door, and we both literally, our jaws hit the floor, we turned and looked at each other and basically said something to the effect, did he just say that? Because this African gray parrot, before I had said what I usually said, he said, "Don't worry, I'll be a good bird."
I like it.
Now, this is a sentence this parrot had never heard before, ever, and put together a proper English sentence in proper English grammar in a context that made sense. Okay. So, again, this to me is evidence that we have to get out of our mind this binary dialectical way of thinking about ourselves and about animals, and start thinking more in terms of a continuum of rationality, a continuum of consciousness, and so on.
So there's some really good. I spend a lot of time with Aboriginal thought, I guess, and I have my whole life. There's an Aboriginal academic, Tyson Yunkaporta, who I really like, and he talks about an Aboriginal understanding of metaphor, because they take it as seriously as you said. Like, how do we know what an apt and inapt metaphor is? And he gives an example. basically, they are powerful transformational processes, but only if they have integrity. And he was talking about a school he went to that he assisted that was having a lot of problems with the kids. Like, they didn't want to be there, there was fighting, there was high truancy, and so on. And he gets to the school, and there's a sort of mural of the kids as fish, and you go, lovely, but they're fish in a net, like they're all kind of together in this net. And he's like, what this is? And they solved it by adjusting the metaphor of the school. So it's like, because you think school and fish, it is an inept metaphor. School, fish depicted in a net, and all of a sudden you have all these kids acting up and feeling like they're in prison, right? And they adjusted the metaphor because a bad metaphor is considered a curse in Aboriginal cultures. You can curse someone with an inept metaphor. It kind of comes back to that idea that it is somehow structural, right? This is kind of when you look for monogenesis, you aren't just looking for words that describe things. You're looking for that kind of the structure of how language both is and interfaces with reality, I guess.
Right. You're looking for a deep structure. Exactly. That squares with Chomskyan insights into linguistics and so on and so forth. It is a deep structure. And I do think it can be, just like Leibniz thought, I do think it can be formally specified. But if you come up with something inept, you're going to get a response because it's unnatural, it's inhuman. We're back to this thing again. What they're trying to do is create something so artificial and so disconnected from reality. They're trying to create a virtual reality, in effect, that is so disconnected from nature that it cannot work, especially in the sense that it's disconnected from human nature. And the inevitable result is you rebel against it. You know?
It's the sin of the demiurge. It doesn't understand the sort of the analog nature of reality, so it builds a synthetic one. It's kind of like looking at the fake pictures inside EU documentation about togetherness, and you go, this is stock photography. It's fake.
Right, exactly.
And unfortunately, I think that kind of ruling elite level, and you can take this as far as you want in terms of possession and so on, I honestly don't think, and this is the sin of the demiurge, that they understand the difference. I honestly think if they put out a stock image of togetherness or a stock image of healthy children getting vaccines, that they think that's reality. And I don't know I'm not sure if people are aware that that's actually the level of conflict that we should be fighting on, right?
It is, and I'll tell you why I think you're onto something there, and that is, if you look at Mr. Globaloney, wanting to bring in this technocratic society, this technocratic culture. Well, what are they really concerned about? If you read their writings on culture, it's all being driven by economics, finance, and so on. And you get David Rockefeller saying, well, we've got to have a global new world order that's run by bankers and businessmen, okay, because they know how things work. Well, no, they don't. They only know how a certain narrow segment of things work. You cannot forge a culture around crony capitalism or finance or economics alone. Culture is much more than that. It's going to the local pub and sitting down and having a pint with your friends and talking and so on and so forth. That's human activity. And this is where these people get it all wrong. They are trying to erect a culture on a very narrow basis that is not cultural at all. And that's the problem. This is why they think all cultures are simply things that can be moved around on a board, and that they should all get along, and that there are no differences between them, and yada yada yada. We've heard it all before, and that's the point. It's not working because that's not culture. No. It's a very narrow segment of human activity within a culture.
It's spent a lot of time in London, and the attitude you're talking about there is they think culture is sort of having a lot of options on Uber Eats. Like it's
yeah, exactly.
It's this kind of technocratic possession of things and little baubles on the shelf, right?
Yes.
And I just I'm going to beg this question because I think at a level, at a kind of Gatesian level, I honestly don't think they can tell the difference between like their demiurgic project in reality. I think they're effectively, whatever we mean by this word, kind of possessed. But I think this is the question I'm going to beg. Why was popular culture a theater of operations for the CIA during the Cold War? Like, just to bring it back to microcosm and medium, because I think there are people, it's almost like forgive them father when it comes to the super elites. But when I look at the stuff that you describe, say microcosm and medium, do you think the people who impacted and manipulated culture during the Cold War thought that way, or do you think they thought like we did, but they were just trying to achieve a goal?
Well, it's complex. My guess is, number one, that they looked at popular culture, especially as it manifested itself in the arts, and said, well, there is too much residual traditional cultural inertia there. And if we're going to accomplish what we want to accomplish, we have to get rid of it, or at least channel it into activities that will be productive for our agenda. But by the same token, I think that there is a certain segment of those people that were driving this agenda that had no awareness, as you say, had no awareness really of what was going on. So I think you've got both kinds of people behind it. People who recognized the threat, and then people who just went along with it because they didn't have any real grounding in the culture. In other words, we've all been familiar with people that are nouveau riche or whatever, and they all of a sudden decide that they want to go to an opera rather than a Steely Dan concert, because that's just what people in their class are supposed to do, So in other words, you've got the fake culture out there that drives a lot of it, that has no real informed appreciation of one thing or the other. And I think that's behind a lot of it. Like you say, the Gates model, begging the question that they really don't have it. But I do suspect that there is a narrow circle of people that do have an understanding of what's really at stake with the traditional culture, be it popular or, the high culture or whatever. And I illustrate that by that wonderful chapter in Thomas Mann's Dr. Faustus, where the composer Leverkühn, who's based on Arnold Schoenberg, actually meets the devil. And the devil offers him one-time irrevocable originality for all time. And the originality that he's offering is break with all traditional past musical culture, which of course he does, but then pays the price. No one else can ever do that again and be original. This is the problem. And by the same token, by so breaking with it, he becomes a one-off, a thing unto himself. So I do think that there are people like that have pushed this.
Yeah. Okay.
But the majority, no. I'm in agreement with you. The majority, no. Mm-mm.
Yeah. So I hadn't heard it described that way in a while. That it's almost like the current op is playing the popular culture op from the mid-20th century at 2.5 speed, right?
Yes, exactly. Exactly.
Well, it's funny. I think about it and go, they have, it's very hypostasis of the archons. Like, they don't realize, and this is the positive part to, I guess, end on, right? And you mentioned Bill Tiller's work a lot, right? The people perpetrating this up, whether there's a small group of them, I think, that are, kind of like culture sorcerers, I suppose. But I don't think the good news is they don't have a full awareness of quite what it is they're dealing with, or quite the sort of game they're playing. And that's really encouraging. And just to bring it full circle back to owning nature culture, right? Like, that is, we've just been talking about metaphors being apt, and this stuff we do is significant individually. Owning the culture, being aware of, showing your kids the paintings of Goya or whatever, like that's a magical act, and I think that's a positive point to end on.
Well, I do too, and I agree. It's intriguing to me that one of the things that has emerged during this whole lockdown thing are people that are doing precisely that. They're taking their spare time and, playing music or reading books or whatever. And in a certain sense, that's accomplishing exactly the reverse of what I think Mr. Globalone wanted to accomplish by the lockdowns, and that was to isolate everybody. Well, in the process of isolating people, they've provided the mechanism for people to reconnect with their history and with their tradition, which to me is what we need more than anything else right now. So, yeah, I think it's backfiring in a major, major way, and it will only continue to do so.
Yeah, I think of it
because, again, you're right. These people have no grounding in real culture themselves. They pretend to. They'll go to an opera Verdi or whoever and have no real appreciation of the man or his music, but it's just something that people in their class do.
Or they'll buy a painting of Bill Clinton in a blue dress.
Or they'll buy, yes, precisely, because it's art, Yeah, right.
It's been interesting down here because obviously I'm on the board of Permaculture Tasmania and so on, so I'm kind of plugged into regenerative agriculture, that kind of stuff, and the demand for local market garden food and local homesteading food, it's tripled. So I have friends who've never done. There are people who are losing their jobs, and they're like, we are turning people away for our veg boxes and so on. And this is the sort of unintended side effect. They're trying to get everyone into again, if you just look at the funding, an industrialized modified pea protein fake meat system, which is essentially it's an impossibility, right? But it's literally demiurgic in its sin, right? Like, in an attempt to do that, its real life responds almost unconsciously. I don't think when people started making all that sourdough bread that they kind of sat with it from a Jungian perspective and said, well, this is a living thing. This is an organism I'm keeping alive and consuming, right? Like, it might have been like a silly Instagram fad, but by the same token, people just kind of somehow knew, I'm going to keep a literal culture alive while I'm under house arrest. And that's the game we're playing. This comes back to the judgmental, but the correct use of metaphor and culture and so on. Whatever happens with the culture planners and the technocrats and so on, you have a better, I'm talking to the audience, you have a better understanding of the game that they're attempting to play, and that's in our favor, I think.
Oh yeah, I do too. I think it's absolutely in our favor, and I see the same things here that you're seeing there. I'm seeing more little farmers markets spring up on street corners. A farmer brings extra melons into town because he wants to sell them, and people are stopping and buying. And they're avoiding the big, so-called organic food chains and so on and so forth. I'm seeing exactly the same thing.
Wow.
And I think it's good.
Yeah, it is good. That's a very positive note to end on, Dr. Farrell. This conversation was a long time coming. I had an absolute blast. And for people who want to know about the new book or where else they can find you, that kind of stuff, and the off chance they're unaware, lay it on us.
Well, they can go for the new book. They can go to my website. It's www.gizadestar.com. Just go to the front page and scroll down, and they'll see the Tower of Babel book. And then that site has all of my other books too, and that's where you can find me.
Wonderful. All right. Well, as I said, absolutely fantastic conversation, an eerily timed book, and and I will have to do this again.
Thanks for having me back on, Gordon. I've enjoyed it.
Very fun stuff for the accidental birthday episode. Like I mentioned during the show, we had originally planned to have a discussion around microcosm and medium, which is in fact several books ago now, but time flies. But the TLDR of microcosm and medium is that it's about both hard and soft mind control, and soft being how culture and discourse and all that can be and are programmed and weaponized as a form of mind control. Even just, repeated phrases like we're hearing at the moment, new normal or fact checker or so on, they all shape outcomes in a particular direction. But when we talk about culture, we're talking about meaning and lifeways and so on. And so the book, and hopefully this discussion, frankly, makes you aware that mind control is a necessary but too limiting description, right? We're talking about a cosmic engagement, a cosmic interplay. And more than that, it's a cosmic engagement that is fought on the microcosmic level, like the U level. So the sort of hermetic-ish description for how magic might work is that the relationship between the microcosm and the macrocosm is harmonic. So the things that you do, the things that you eat, the things that you say and feel and think have some kind of resonance with the whole universe because you are in a harmonic relationship with it, right? At first blush, that's wonderful. And it is wonderful. But it also comes with, I guess, the stark realization that what you do in and with your life has cosmic significance, right? So the trajectories toward flourishing and authenticity all come from and through you. It matters. Cosmically, it matters. It might not seem like it, that you plant some native endemics, local wild grasses that create insect habitat, even in a small space. It matters what you assent and consent to. It means, I guess, in a way, there are no days off, but it shouldn't be work. It should be joy. So there are also no days on. And I guess it's in that wider context of capital M meaning that capital T true things like the Tower of Babel operate. It's somehow, in the case of the Tower of Babel, it's somehow a thing that happened and is always happening and is kind of like a warning. I think it's a warning rather than a threat, right? But this is why I'm so interested in the indigenous understandings of metaphor, which the premium members are working through with the road opening module at the moment. To use Dr. Farrell's term, if an inept metaphor can be used as a curse, right? It's probably somehow because things like the Fall and the Tower of Babel and other profound archetypes are a kind of true that is importantly true. All words in that sentence said with capital letters, right? So anyway, good chat. Long-time listeners and premium members will be aware I'm very inspired by Eduardo Cohn's notion of forest language and an indigenous understanding, or forest cognition as well, but an indigenous understanding of metaphor is sort of how all these capital lettered things move through both like the literal and metaphoric forest of life. And that's why this episode ended up being the accidental birthday one, and it's timed around, although it's free for everyone clearly, but it's timed to coincide with some of the work the premium members are doing, right? And the language music stuff that that Dr. Farrell in many of his books traces through history is in many respects I guess a usefully different variant of that same quest to understand how and what capital lettered things are, like meaning things, and what our relationship to them is, and in what do they move, right? So yeah, that's this week's show. I'm uploading this from a national park in the middle of the island, actually. So the internet connections are a bit patchy. Apologies if you want something or need something urgently from me and there is a slight delay in responses. Yeah. Until next time.